So before we get started today, I wish to acknowledge that today and tomorrow, academics across the world are striking in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and that we support those who are standing firm against bigotry and violence. Welcome everyone to Medieval Freelancing 101, the first of two webinars sponsored and organized by the Medieval Academy of America. I would first like to thank Lisa Fagan-Davis and Laura Moreale for their support and their hard work in putting together these events. The second will be held 2 weeks from today, on Tuesday, September 22nd, also at 1 p.m. Today's webinar will be focused on para-academic work, and our presenters all engage in freelance work that interfaces with academia to varying degrees, including editing, translation, indexing, and proofreading. And just as importantly, all of our panelists have found ways to parlay these skills into rewarding work both inside and outside academia. It is our hope that the discussion and resources that we offer today will be of use to anyone from current graduate students and early career researchers, all the way to academics who are in the middle or towards the end of their careers looking to find different paths and looking to branch out using their existing skill sets. So the way that this webinar is going to be organized, each of our four panelists is going to do a short introduction explaining who they are, what they do, and how they sort of came to be in those positions. And afterward, we'll open the floor to questions. So please do hold your questions until all of the introductions are done. And when you are ready to ask them, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Don't try to use the chat is disabled. So please try to use the question and answer section. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And we will begin with Sara Torres. She is a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia and a freelance editor for several tech, digital marketing, and educational companies. She earned her PhD from UCLA in English in 2014, and her research focuses on late medieval literature, manuscript studies, and literature of the 100 Years' War. She is currently completing her book manuscript entitled Marvelous Generations, Lancastrian Afterlives in England and Iberia, 1400 to 1624. She has previously served as the assistant editor of Speculum and as a volunteer legal translator for Sin Barreras, a Charlottesville-based organization serving immigrant communities. And I'll turn it over to Sara.
Thank you, Kavita, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Medieval Academy for organizing this wonderful webinar series and to welcome all of the attendees who are joining us. My remarks today will be aimed at graduate students and early career scholars who are freelance curious. In other words, those who are new to the idea of freelancing, but who want to develop a professional skill set that will serve them whether they ultimately pursue traditional academic career paths or other roles in other industries. Freelancing, I want to emphasize, can be a rewarding and even empowering professional experience, one that complements your academic research and broadens your professional community outside of academia. I started freelancing to support my research funding, but I found that it has been a steady, really significant source of professional work as I navigated the academic job market and explored various roles in higher education and beyond. My own academic research, teaching, and editing work has always been very intimately interwoven. I found that I enjoyed commenting on the work of my peers in writing groups, and that providing feedback to students at all stages of writing helped me in turn become a diplomatic and supportive editor. Being the assistant editor at Speculum with the support of the Medieval Academy also gave me an appreciation for the rich and diverse methodologies and disciplines encompassed in the field of medieval studies. But it also showed me how a really rigorous editorial calendar is created and executed. For those who are currently in a structured graduate program, these years can be an excellent opportunity to lay the foundations for a freelancing business. While your time may be at a premium, it's true, you will also have the benefits of flexibility, library access, and access to a supportive and diverse campus community that can help you develop a network, and even launch a freelancing business. So my 3 takeaway pieces of advice for those just starting out would be to first create content Second, build a network. And third, cultivate a few discrete skill sets. And in the remaining time, I'll be talking about each of these topics or tasks in turn. So first, creating content. So if you're interested in freelancing, one of the most impactful steps that you can take right now is to begin creating content. This could take many forms: a podcast, a series of Medium articles, a humor piece on Slackjaw, writing guest blogs for your university or for local nonprofit organizations, or writing grant proposals. The idea is to have 3 to 4 mid to long form bylines that show both depth and range of interest. Many potential clients, especially corporate clients, will ask for a writing portfolio of pieces of different lengths, in different voices, and aimed at different audiences. So having them at the ready is one of the first steps that you can take if you're interested in freelancing. A portfolio or a website will act as your calling card, much more so in many ways than a resume or an academic CV. And whether these projects relate directly to your academic research or not is really up to you. Now, extra writing is not necessarily an idea that will appeal to all early career scholars who already have the pressure of producing a dissertation, articles, and teaching syllabi. But there are ways to work efficiently, I think. To use these writing projects to engage in conversations about your work, to write guest posts for repositories where you're conducting research, or to reflect on positive teaching experiences. In my case, many of my writing projects are not directly about my academic research, although there are certainly thematic through lines that join the two. People will often tell you that it's helpful to have a niche, a few topics you feel you have a personal connection to, or that you have some authority to speak about. My beats, as it were, are early English literature, food and culture, and musical theater. So right now I'm currently writing a piece about presidential politics and elections in the lyrics of Ira Gershwin. Write about what you're obsessed with or angry about, or about the topics that sort of hold on to you and won't let go. And this can be a really effective way of creating a well-rounded and diverse writing portfolio. And if you're primarily interested in coaching or editing, I would consider also including pieces that reflect the kinds of projects you want to work on, whether that's academic writing, witty cultural commentary, or op-eds. So for instance, if you're interested in coaching older adults who are writing a memoir, then it would be a good idea to write a personal essay yourself, or an analytic piece on the history of life writing. The second important step to starting out as a freelancer is to reach out to as many people as you can think of to let them know that you're looking for work. Networking has a bad rap sometimes because it can seem shallow or transactional, sort of like the marriage of Lady Mead and falseness. But at the end of the day, networking entails reaching out to the people who are already in your life in some way, people that you trust and that you truly believe want the best for you. And this can be your pub trivia meetup group, your mom's quilting circle, your college friends, or your cousins. If you're like me, you have many, so that's a good place to start. And the truth is, you never really know who's working at an organization where someone is transitioning between roles, where someone's about to go on parental leave, or an organization that simply needs extra hands on deck to steady and regularize the workflow. The truth is, most of my quote unquote networking is the result of simply living my life and doing the things that I enjoy, whether that's getting involved in environmental projects, taking creative writing classes, or studying languages. I met my mentor in freelancing, the woman and friend who helps me with everything from setting rates to creating contracts, in an online creative writing class that I took for fun. So when you find your people, you find your network. So let your network know that you are growing your freelancing business and be able to articulate what types of services you will offer. Are you primarily interested in editing academic projects? Do you want to work on topics or projects related to finance, to law, to policy, to advocacy? Are you more interested in developmental editing or proofreading, a topic that I think will be covered later in the webinar? And as with everything, having a bit of entrepreneurial spirit is key. Identify a need that already exists and consider how you might address it. Do faculty members or graduate students have research funds? What does it take to become an official vendor at local universities so that faculty and staff can use those funds to hire you to work on their projects? As an example of this, I partner with a company called Speak, Language Center in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is a small business founded by an Italian literature PhD named Christina Ball. And through Speak, I sometimes work with faculty members who want to use their professional development funds to support their writing projects. And I found Christina and Speak through another medieval PhD, Rebecca Hill, who teaches Arabic for the company. Now, if you're still in graduate school, you can see if there are any discretionary funds for you to pursue a community engagement project or teach a service learning class, to create an online resource, to write a guest blog, or even to mentor undergraduate students in the humanities in their career paths. And sometimes you have to pitch ideas to several people at your institution to create these funding streams. So it helps to know what your institution's priorities and initiatives are at the moment. Now, to clarify, this is not about giving a blanket yes to all departmental service requests and demands upon your time, but rather to choose which projects have value added specifically for you, which roles give you a sense of purpose and bring you into contact with the most people to build your own professional network. If you do take on some free labor, make sure that you have a reason for it, either to build your portfolio, to forge connections with specific organizations, or to cultivate mentors. For me, this means that I seek out opportunities to work with organizations whose mission I support. So for instance, I care a lot about environmental justice. So I reached out to the local branch of the Sierra Club to see if I could help edit their monthly newsletter. And they wrote right back and said they would love to have help for that. And I'm also collaborating on a project with a local conservation trust about how they are promoting diverse access to urban green space during the coronavirus crisis. So thinking about organizations that you're already interfacing with in some way and how you might be able to support them. And then to me, this has been the most effective way of cultivating that network that eventually people have reached out to me about writing or editing projects. So the last step that I want to mention is to cultivate discrete skill sets according to your interests, whether digital or familiarizing yourself with specific editorial style sheets, and pursuing these, sort of developing these skill sets, ideally by working on collaborative projects where you are compensated in some way. So I worked on creating digital content for special collections when I was a graduate student at UCLA. And this professionalization activity can happen quite organically. So I mastered Chicago style when I worked at Speculum, and then later on I became an AP style nut when I worked with the client for several months on creating press releases. And I had to really sort of absorb and master that particular style. You can also sort of identify specific interests and skills that would help you reach out to potential clients. So this could be as simple as going to a library presentation on using Tableau or Adobe InDesign, to work on a project where a CMS like HubSpot or Trello or Asana are used, or creating a WordPress site for your school's medieval colloquium. Two areas I focused on personally were project management and time management, areas where I had ample room to grow. Using the online resources at the Center for Faculty Diversity and Development, I worked very hard to structure and document my time so that I was able to balance my academic and freelance work and create a really sort of detailed log for my clients. I also took a project management class through DHSI to learn how to break large projects down into smaller tasks and plug these into a calendar. And this in turn helped me approach my academic work with more efficiency and ultimately helped me sort of finally finish my doctoral dissertation. So by way of conclusion, for early career scholars who are looking to support themselves during this time, and for those exploring all the career possibilities out there, I want to say this: you have the talent, the marketable skills, and the drive to support yourself and to solve real life problems. We live in the midst of an information economy that desperately needs people who can synthesize and communicate information accurately and support others as they do that as well. People to advocate for equitable policies and more inclusive institutions. Your para or post-academic work both enriches our intellectual communities and redresses the failures of higher education to compensate traditional academic labor in a fair and transparent way. The first steps in freelancing often involve reflection on your own interests, skills, and values, as well as what personal or societal goals you would like to work on. The good news is that this process will give you the chance to reach out to individuals who inspire you and organizations that motivate you, and will ultimately offer you another option in a very dynamic professional and economic landscape. So thank you, and good luck to everyone.
Thanks so much, Sara. Our next speaker is Jonathan Farr. He is a full-time freelance editor and indexer. He has a BA in history from the Washington University in St. Louis, an MA in medieval studies from the University College London, and a PhD in history from the University of Michigan, where his research addressed space, memory, and identity in southern France in the 13th and 14th centuries. In addition to working on academic texts, he edits translations of French language graphic novels and webtoons, which I personally find fantastic. So I'll hand it over to Jonathan.
All right, thank you. So a little bit about me in terms of how I got into freelancing. I don't want to speak too much about it, but I began editing in the last few years of graduate school. So I graduated in 2016. And so I was looking ahead at a, scary academic job market, and ultimately choosing not to put myself through that, not to go on the academic job market. And so I was looking for something else. And so I think, a lot of you might be in a similar situation. And I was able to transition somewhat slowly, not terribly slowly, to full-time freelance work in editing and indexing. And I wanted to highlight indexing in particular. It's actually a relatively small part of the business that I do, most of which is editing, but it's not always, I think, a kind of work that is thought of. Editing and translation are typically, some of the big two that come up when you're talking about para-academic work or alt-ac careers. But indexing is, I think, a kind of work that an academic background prepares you for fairly well. There is more to learn, of course, but you do have a lot of the necessary skills. If you like, synthesizing information, as Sara was saying, this kind of work might be for you. And it is intellectually rewarding and not as tedious as many people think. So I just kind of wanted to mention it as something that you might be interested in looking into. And to that end, I wanted to share just a few places you can go to get started. The Chicago Manual of Style obviously has a chapter on indexing. There's another important book, Nancy Mulvaney's Indexing Books, very blunt title, but that's been kind of a standard recommendation in the field for decades now. I think it was first published in 1994. There are also a lot of courses and certificate granting programs that you can find if you're still affiliated with the university. If you have a school of library or information science, they probably offer a course on indexing. You can actually find a list of courses elsewhere on the website of the American Society for Indexing, which is that last bullet point that I've put up there, asindexing.org, and there's a lot of information there if you're interested in looking into this kind of work. So that's really all I wanted to do, was to put that up briefly so that you can come back to that and see where to go. But what I really want to do, other than put indexing on your radar, is talk about some very more business side aspects of running a freelancing business. First, two things that I found helpful in terms of finding and landing clients. professional associations, being a member of a professional association, which comes with other benefits, but is a way of finding work. And then kind of developing a web presence that you can capitalize on alongside those networks that you've built as part of your academic career. And then I want to talk about two things that can cause anxiety, and these are kind of more nitty-gritty details. I know that we've already had a question about setting rates, and so that is something that I'm going to hopefully give you directions to go in concerning. And then I want to talk about paying taxes. So I am a full-time freelancer. Paying taxes can be stressful, and I just want to alert you to a few things you absolutely need to know in advance. Some of these things, you know, I wish that I had known them before starting. All of them, any one of them, you could have a 90-minute webinar devoted just to that element. So my discussion will be fairly superficial, but hopefully give you some directions that you can go in to learn more. So first, I want to talk about being a member of a professional association, and I'm going to use as an example the EFA, so the Editorial Freelancers Association. Let me just pull that up here. Just pulling up the website here for you to see. There's a lot of good information on this website, even if you're not a member. But if you are a member, it comes with certain benefits. There is a membership fee, of course, so this is a business expense. But you have lots of opportunities to network specifically with other language professionals. You have lots of access to professional development opportunities, webinars, workshops, there's an annual conference, all of that, of course, you get with membership. But I want to kind of highlight various ways of finding work with something like the Editorial Freelancers Association. There are two ways to do this. There's a job list and that you have access to if you are a member, and I get daily emails from this job list. So when clients post something, I just checked my email and there are 3 this morning already. And that is an easy way to find work. And if I feel qualified for it and I have room in my calendar, I'll follow up with them, and I have gotten jobs that way. So that's one way to do it. Also, I want to highlight that you can have a profile in their membership directory. And this can be a really good marketing tool and a start to developing your web presence if you haven't already. And having you know, a place on the web that is devoted to you as an editor and devoted to your freelance business. The directory is searchable by clients, and I have actually, you know, you can be found through it, and I have been found through it and tapped for various projects. In fact, one of my most consistent gigs, and consistency is hard to come by in freelancing sometimes, came from someone finding me in the directory. And it's also nice to just have something online that you can point clients to, say, by the way, you can check out my profile on the EFA's website, because that does give you a kind of legitimacy. It gives your business legitimacy, and it shows that you're not just kind of randomly grabbing gig work wherever you can to make a buck, but that you are an editor and you have committed to that work. And I think that's important. And of course, I would say that a better place to do that, better than having a profile even on the EFA's website, is to have a website of your own. And in this day and age, I really think you can't do freelancing without having a website that in some way is devoted to your freelance business, because it does give you legitimacy, and it's a place for you to kind of shape your professional identity as an editor, and it's an important marketing channel. And to that end, not to engage in too much self-promotion here, I will kind of pull up my website just so you can see it, just as a possible model. I know that other participants have websites too that you can look at. But this is a place where, importantly, you can, you know, provide summaries of your different services, and clients can read those and see that you actually know what you're talking about, which is pretty important. You can include testimonials, and these can go a long way towards justifying your rates, towards showing clients that you are worth what you say you're worth, and others agree, others that you've done work for. And then, of course, this is another place for potential clients to find you. I get inquiries through my contact form here all the time, which I personalized, you know, with a medieval drawing of a scribe. And so I encourage you to kind of do little touches like that. Now, there obviously is a cost to running a website. Like being a member of a professional association, it is a business expense, but I think it's well worth it. And there are various, you know, platforms. I used Wix, W-I-X, to create my website. It's very user-friendly. Pick a layout, drag and drop. You don't need any kind of experience in website building in order to be able to do this. And it is something that I think has been very useful to me and helpful in finding work and directing clients my way. So that's kind of just what I wanted to say about, you know, web presence. Moving on to rates, I know that we've already had a question about it, and that was one of the hardest things for me, was figuring out how to set rates. I was not used to assigning a monetary value to my labor, specifically to you know, my hourly labor. And I do use hourly rates. You don't have to. There are various ways of setting rates for different kinds of editing. You can do per word, you know, rate, you know, per 1,000 words. I think that hourly is a good place to start, especially if you're not used to judging how long projects will take. It offers you a little bit of protection from kind of screwing up and doing a lot of work and then not getting paid for that time that you put into the project. So where do I go to figure out how to set rates? Well, here I'm actually going to direct you back to the EFA's website, because they have an entire section of their website that is devoted to rates. And they've produced this list of types of works, estimated pace, and range of fees by surveying their members. I took part in the last survey. It was in April, I think. So this is a place to go to see what other people are charging and kind of position yourself in relation to that. So it's a place to start from, and then look at this, take into account your particular experience, your skills, as well as the nature of the project. You know, is there specialized knowledge that's required, multiple languages, for example, which I'm sure many of you have, because these things will call for a higher rate. So that is one place to go to just kind of get started. And they have all these, you know, different kinds of editing. Writing is on here too, translating. There are a number of types of work that they've kind of surveyed their members for. So that is one way to do it, to go there and figure out, you know, what other people are charging. To be honest, even if you do it that way, and especially if you want to go full time, I would recommend that you approach it another way as well, and that is to work backwards from an annual income, right? That is your goal. So set an annual income goal and work backwards from that to figure out what your hourly rate needs to be, given how many weeks you want to work a year and how many hours a day you want to work, to come to an hourly rate. And this way, doing it this way, then you can really see if the rates that you maybe hit upon by that other method, by looking at the EFA's website, will allow you to be where you want to be or where you need to be financially, because that is really important if you want to do this full time. Can you make full-time freelancing work? You need to figure out if you're in the financial situation where that will work out for you. So there are various places online that you can go to see kind of calculations of how to work backwards from an annual income goal. A couple things though, I just want to mention, you do need to keep in mind certain expenses, some of which will come right off the top, such as taxes, right? Business expenses. There's a lot of unbillable work that goes into freelancing, emailing, invoicing. I spend a lot of time sending emails, and that's not, you know, part of the work, that part of my billable hours. Health insurance, you know, you don't have an employer to provide health insurance, and of course vacation. You have to take into account the fact that, you know, you don't get paid vacation days when you don't have an employer. So these are all things that are important to keep in mind when you're coming at it backwards like that. And to be honest, figuring out rates and estimates is something that I really think only gets easier as you do it. And it's fairly common to undersell yourself, to come in low. I'd encourage you to resist the inclination to do that. You are all coming in with skills and relevant experience, even if you haven't edited professionally before, and those letters after your name do actually mean something. So as soon as you feel comfortable, think about raising your rates. The first couple times I did, many of my clients, my regular clients, didn't even bat an eye and said things like, "Oh, well deserved," or "It's high time." So that is something to keep in mind. Finally, I want to talk briefly about taxes, which can be fairly stressful, and certainly if you're a full-time freelancer, you have to think about them. First, you have to decide on a designation for your business. So there are two you can choose from: sole proprietorship or LLC, limited liability company. Various websites will break down the differences for you. I can only speak to the sole proprietorship angle. I'm a sole proprietor. In brief, sole proprietorship is easier to set up. There's not really any startup cost. You don't have to, there's no paperwork to fill out. You simply start working under your own name, and your business and personal finances can commingle. They can be combined. With an LLC, they have to be kept separate. That's a difference. And then you file taxes as an individual. So taxes are handled through your personal filing. Now, really quick disclaimer, I am not a tax professional. Consult a tax professional. If I had to give you one piece of advice, that would be it. I'm not a financial advisor. Don't take financial advice from me. All of that applies here. But there are a couple things that it's important for you to know. First, you will pay more as a self-employed individual. There's a self-employment tax on top of the income tax. How much? It depends on how much you make. Generally, they say set aside a quarter of every check that comes your way for taxes. I have a separate bank account, and a quarter of every check that I get is transferred into that bank account and used solely for the purposes of paying taxes on that income. And I think that's a good way to handle it. Now, taxes are handled through your personal filing, so you claim this income at the end of the year. But another thing to think about is quarterly estimated tax, right? Do you have to pay it? Maybe. If you're a full-time freelancer, probably. Yes, you do need to. If you're just really moonlighting, not really making a lot of income off of freelance work, you might not have to. And there are a few other exceptions, but generally they say if you expect to owe over $1,000 in taxes on the income, you need to pay quarterly estimated tax. So I just want to put that on your radar as something to consider. There's a form, a 1040 estimated tax form. And there are a couple ways of kind of calculating that. For example, one's called annualized estimated tax if you have irregular income. And again, it can be a little complicated. So I just want to say again, consult a tax professional. And I'll kind of end there because I think I've gone over my 15 minutes. But there are a lot of challenges to running a freelance business, to running the business side of things. Hopefully, I mean, I've tried to give you some kind of practical, actionable advice, places to go to. And I just want to briefly say there are also a lot of benefits to freelancing that I should end on a high note and just talk about. There's a lot of flexibility, set your own hours, maybe have an easier time finding that work-life balance that is so elusive. So it is the kind of career that has a lot of challenges, but I think also a lot of advantages, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Our third speaker is Jennifer Paxton. She is a clinical associate professor of history at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where she is also the director of the University Honors Program. She received her BA in history from Yale and her PhD in history from Harvard. Her research focuses on monastic historical writing in England and Normandy in the Anglo-Norman period. She has produced 3 video courses on medieval history for the Great Courses and lectures frequently for Smithsonian Associates. She is also an associate editor of the Catholic Historical Review and the proofreader for Osiris, the themed journal of the History of Science Society. And I will turn it over to Jen.
Thank you very much. Just share my screen. Thank you very much, Kavita, for hosting us, to Laura for organizing the panel, to my fellow panelists for sharing their experiences. I have learned a lot from all of you. And I want to begin by thanking the Medieval Academy of America, not just for giving us this forum today, but for providing me with my first experience of academic publishing. So I spent the summer after I passed my general exam in graduate school working on the index for Speculum, back when it actually came out in paper. And I still owe an enormous debt to Jackie Brown, who taught me how to index with great patience and was just generally so lovely to me. She was an amazing mentor. And it's still a little bit surreal to me that Speculum now resides 2 floors above me in McMahon Hall at Catholic University under the expert guidance of my treasured colleague, Dr. Kate Jansen, to whom I owe another debt that I can never repay. What I want to talk about today is how the kinds of freelance gigs that we're all talking about can pay off both personally and professionally in the long run. And I think that's helpful because by the very nature of freelance work, as we've been saying, it can feel very short-term, contingent, and unstable. And I assure you, it has often felt that way to me. But I'm here to say that while there are no guarantees, there is reason to hope that your efforts will be rewarded. So in order to do that, I hope you will indulge me in a little bit of Lebenslauf, because I think it will illustrate the point I want to make. And I think you'll hear in my story some of the themes that you've already heard from our first 2 speakers. So I'm going to tell you how I ended up doing para-academic work and then why I have found it so valuable in my current position. So here's my story. I am a trailing spouse. And a lot of my professional experiences have flowed from that fact. That is not by any means the only way that one ends up in para-academic work, but it is one way, and I don't think it's a rare way. So I met my husband when we were both taking intensive German at Yale. I was an undergrad following the advice of my advisor who knew that I would need German to do medieval studies. That was totally true. And he was a grad student preparing to do field work in Germany. And I like to just mention from the outset, he was not my TA. He followed me to Cambridge when I started grad school at Harvard and finished his dissertation remotely. And then I followed him to Washington, D.C. when he got a teaching job at American University. And I finished my dissertation remotely in turn. But along the way, we had a baby. Eventually, we had 3 babies. So quick maternal bragging interlude. Baby number 1. Baby number 2. Baby number 3, right? Now, I'll leave that one up because it's just so cute. My husband was busy trying to get tenure at American University. And for me, looking for academic jobs outside of DC did not seem practical. And I know there are people who pull this off with great aplomb, but I just felt that for me personally, I was not going to be willing to do it. So living in the DC area on one very, very junior assistant professor's salary was not easy. And with me at the dissertation stage and unable to TA from afar, presume, I needed a way to supplement our income. And here is where networking comes in. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got is the same one that Sara shared in the first talk, which is to tell everybody you know that you are looking for work. That's how I had gotten a job that I held during my gap year between undergrad and grad school. I worked at the language lab at Yale because I told everybody I needed a job, and that's how I got one. And this is also how I got my first foot in the freelance door. I went to a party given by a friend from Yale who had moved to DC after finishing a PhD in English at Cornell. He had not found an academic job, so he was starting a position at Congressional Quarterly Books. And he mentioned that they were always looking for proofreaders. Now, I already knew that I had a knack for proofreading and indeed, in fact, a passion for it. When I was doing my dissertation research, actually at Cambridge University, that's where the archives were that I needed, I had the amazing luck to have a medievalist for a landlord. I mean, that's just amazing, right? His name was Jacques Bourrois, and he was working on a book manuscript. And since he was French, he needed a little help polishing up his English. So I volunteered to help him clean up the manuscript. and I found that I absolutely adored the work. It was a nice diversion from some of the nittier and grittier aspects of dissertation research. And I should say that only a medievalist would find it restful to turn from their charters to somebody else's charters, but there you are. So back to my friend in DC, Congressional Quarterly Books. I told him that proofreading sounded fun. So he arranged for me to take a proofreading test, which I passed. And for the next couple of years, while I was finishing my dissertation and taking care of son number one, the Rocket Man, I did freelance jobs for Congressional Quarterly Books, often at very odd hours of the day and night, 2 in the morning, nap time. And I worked on a wide variety of texts. They ranged from the, shall we say, supremely boring, right? This is the latest edition of this book. I worked on an issue, let's just say a while ago, to the morbidly fascinating. I proofread a volume of important speeches from the last year. And this included the Unabomber Manifesto. So I actually proofread the Unabomber. So that was a little bit odd. But I really honed my craft during this period. The head copy editor at the press took me under her wing. She would comment on my proofreading and find places where she thought I could improve it. And I learned a tremendous amount from her. I learned the ropes. I learned all of the lingo and the symbols. I trained my eye to look for bad breaks, and now I am a bad break fanatic, right? You just cannot get a bad break by me. I learned to look for widows and orphans, and don't try to read the Latin. This is a famous proofreading trick. It doesn't make sense. Along the way, I also picked up some adjunct teaching, as one does, but I ended up needing to give up both the teaching and the proofreading in order to finally get the dissertation done. I found I couldn't juggle childcare, dissertation writing, and outside employment, so we bit the bullet, we tightened our belts, and we just concentrated on getting me over the PhD line. So to cut a long story short, I had another baby, I was adjuncting at Georgetown, when I saw an email go around the history department listserv asking if anybody knew of a grad student who was available to do some proofreading. Now, I wasn't still a grad student, but money was still very tight, so I answered the ad. It was from my colleague, Kathy Olesko, who had just begun a term as series editor for Osiris, the themed journal of the History of Science Society. And of course, the sister publication of Osiris is Isis, right? So Osiris publishes a volume every year, and they needed a proofreader. And this was the beginning of one of the most satisfying professional experiences I have ever had. Kathy and I worked extremely closely over the next 10 years, and I have continued to work remotely with her successors as series editor to this day. And working on Osiris gave me an intimate knowledge of every phase of journal production. I work very closely with the copy editor. She and I read every article multiple times, both before and after it is typeset. And along the way, I've gotten to correspond with some of the authors, some of whom are in fact very famous. They're people you will have heard of. And I was largely very impressed by how gracious they were, since of course they're only hearing from me because I've found a problem with their article, but usually they're very happy to have been saved from some infelicity or other. About 10 years ago, I was given the opportunity to teach at Catholic University as a replacement for Dr. Jansen while she was on leave. And due to a series of other sabbaticals, I stayed on. And then I was asked to be assistant director of the honors program. And then after 3 years, I became director, and here I am. But I have continued to work on Osiris throughout. I love it so much that I cannot give it up. And here I will finally do what I promised to do at the beginning, which is tell you why this work has been helpful to me. The first reason is that it is intellectually satisfying in itself. It's like solving a puzzle. You're combing through the text, looking for the tiniest flaw. And I have found errors as small as one character printed in the wrong font, one diacritical mark out of place. And each time I feel the satisfaction of having saved a fellow scholar from something that might have been slightly embarrassing. And I've gotten to use a number of my skills. For example, my languages have come in very handy in a number of ways. Many of the articles in Osiris draw heavily on foreign language sources and scholarship, and it has been far easier to proofread these articles with the French, German, and Latin that I had to learn for graduate school. My most recent triumph was catching a discrepancy in the figures from the census for a small German territory in the early 19th century. And in order to fix it, I had to go to the online database it drew from and look up the original number. And I don't think I could have negotiated that database without German. So the German came in handy in the end. I also feel that I am learning a lot. Only a few of the articles are medieval, but broadly speaking, it's an excellent journal. It is historical. It's history of science, but that's history. And I am inspired by the scholarship I'm reading to persevere with my own scholarship. And I also proofread the index for the journal, and I don't think I could do that task nearly as effectively if I had not served that apprenticeship on Speculum many years ago. So in addition to feeling that I'm using my skills, I also feel that I am doing service to the profession. Writing may seem like a solitary activity, but we all know that it cannot be done alone. When I am trying to persuade my students to go to the freaking writing center, I always show them the acknowledgements at the beginning of an academic book or article, and you can always see there the number of people who are thanked for helping the author. Now, usually my help is anonymous, but I know it has been valuable nonetheless. So the work is very satisfying, it's all absorbing, it's fun, and it makes me feel really useful. But there is another, perhaps more serious and more pragmatic reason I have persisted with it, and that is because it has taught me a number of things that have helped me profoundly in the job that I am now privileged to hold. First, through my work at Catholic University, I was able to secure a place as one of the associate editors of the Catholic Historical Review, which, like Speculum, is based at Catholic. So here you can see that is how close we are. We're really close neighbors, the two journals. It helped enormously in my work on the journal that I was already familiar with how to edit to a style sheet. So we have a slightly different style sheet for the CHR than we use on Osiris, but I was able to negotiate the differences very easily. I had learned a lot about journal production from Osiris that I was able to carry over to CHR, and I've learned more still. And I don't think I would have gotten this opportunity without my experience on Osiris. Second, as part of my responsibilities as honors director, I am one of the faculty editors for our undergraduate research journal. And every year I teach the students how to copy edit and proofread. And then I check their work meticulously twice, just as I do with Osiris. And I would not be nearly as effective a mentor to these students if I had not taken that first proofreading job at Congressional Quarterly Books all that time ago as an underemployed graduate student. And finally, my work as a proofreader has improved both my own writing and my ability to teach students how to write. Of course, most of the writing I see on the journal is excellent, but not all. Some of our authors are not native speakers of English, for example, but the process of untangling their prose has taught me a lot about how to improve my own writing and about how to explain to my students why they should make a different choice in sentence structure or phrasing. It turns out that focusing on writing makes you a better writer. Who knew? Now, I didn't end up making para-academic work my main professional path in the long run, but I might have. I have at various points been offered other substantial freelance opportunities, and I ended up turning them down because I had found more teaching work. But I mention this because I think it's important to note that I could have gone that way, and I would have found that satisfying as well. And sometimes I think I will go into this work on a more full-time basis after I retire because it is that fun and rewarding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Okay, our final speaker is Matthew Coneys. He teaches translation from Italian at the University of Oxford and Italian language and paleography at the Warburg Institute, the University of London. He studied for a BA in modern and medieval languages at Cambridge and a PhD in Italian studies at Warwick. His research focuses on medieval and Renaissance travel accounts and their circulation in manuscript and print. He also works as a freelance academic editor and translator with previous projects published by Brill, Springer, and the University of Chicago Press. I'll turn it over to Matthew.
Great. Thank you, Kavita, and to everyone who's been involved in organising today's session. I've learned just a tremendous amount already. And I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about my experience of working as a freelance academic translator. It's going to be something of a whistle-stop tour, really. I'm going to try and keep it as practical as possible, and really to give you a sense of how you can start to gain a bit of experience working in this field, and some of the doors as well that it might open for you in your academic career too. As I'm sure you've gathered from the accent, I'm a Brit, and I was born in the UK and have mainly lived and trained here with a couple of stints in Italy. I graduated from my PhD in early 2017, and I was really committed at the time to what I saw as a normal, quote unquote, academic career. So I took up the first of what was to be the first of several fixed term postdoctoral positions. And I'm sure, as is familiar to many of you, these were invariably part-time or not full-time, quite short-term contracts, and they involved jumping from one institution to another, from one discipline to the next, with alarming regularity. And crucially for me, they ultimately failed to achieve what I thought at the time was my primary goal, i.e. landing a tenured job, or the kind of 3-year prestigious research fellowship that one might obtain to put you in the running for a tenured job down the line. I'm fortunate, and I can say this with hindsight, that throughout this period, I was beginning to gain experience in para-academic freelancing, initially with the sole goal of supplementing my income. And actually, I'm at the point now where I balance my teaching almost 50-50 with my freelance work, depending on the time of year. Obviously, as we've learned already, freelancing is a really useful, regular, flexible source of income. But I've also found that it can it brings a value which kind of goes beyond that a lot of the time. If you permit me, I'd like to share this quote, which is taken from a report by 2 researchers at Newcastle University in the UK into the effects of academic casualisation. I read this report a bit earlier this year, and this line really stuck with me. They found that, and I quote, "Casualised academic labour is fundamentally dehumanising in that it renders staff invisible and vulnerable, curtails their agency and freedom, and prevents them from rendering a long-term narrative of their career that can provide meaning to their lives." Now, this certainly struck a bell with me. I imagine that it may be chiming with many of you as you read this. Obviously, casualisation is a huge issue, and we don't have time to go into it in any great detail here. But what I can say is that working as a freelancer has helped me to address some of these issues on a personal level. It's given me much more of a sense of agency and freedom, and it's also helped me to construct a narrative about what I do, which gives me a lot more satisfaction than I previously had. So I also do some work as an editor, but I'm going to speak exclusively about translation to you today. This comes with 2 caveats. The first, of course, is that I live and work in the UK. And while translation is necessarily and fundamentally an international business, I can't speak directly to working in a US context. So if I skip over anything that's relevant in that respect, then you'll have to forgive me. And I also have to say that I can only draw on my personal experience here. But if you come from a different background, there's no reason why you shouldn't have just as much or even more success as a translator than I have. So to begin, I'm going to briefly touch on a few key tips for gaining initial experience in academic translation. And I think this is probably one of the most important things for a budding translator. How can you look to begin building a profile? Unlike other sectors in the translation world, academic translation is not hugely professionalized. Most academic translators trained as scholars. They may have acquired their language skills in different ways, in any number of ways really, and they've probably never received any formal training in translation. There are also relatively few professional agencies that provide academic translation services, which means that most translators are working directly with their clients. The first question I think to ask yourself, and it's a very obvious one really, but what are your areas of expertise? Your training as a medievalist can open up some really interesting linguistic possibilities. You might be able to translate not only from modern French, but also from Old French. You might be confident in medieval Latin or Renaissance Italian. If you're really lucky, of course, you might be bilingual and able to translate both into and out of English. These are all specialist skills, it's important to remember, and they're things that even most native speakers of a language don't necessarily possess. I'm repeating a common theme here, and I think that's a good thing. I think really one of the biggest first steps to make in any kind of freelancing work, and certainly when you're stepping out into freelance translation, is to make the most of your existing networks. Ask around in your department so that faculty and graduate students know that you're a willing translator of their work. And if you have academic contracts in a country that speaks your source language, then consider asking them to mention you to their colleagues. And as Jonathan mentioned earlier on, it's particularly helpful in this day and age if you can point people towards even a very basic website with details of your qualifications, a portfolio of your previous work, and possibly your standard rates. Rates, of course, as Jonathan mentioned, are crucial and one of the trickier things to get to grips with when you're starting off as a freelancer. One resource I can point you towards, and this is specifically for translation, is pros.com, a freelancing platform that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. But this is their average rate calculator. So you can select a language pairing. You can also select a field of expertise and the currency, and it will present the average rates per word and per hour for all of the translators registered on their site. So that can be a good first port of call when you're thinking about what kind of rates to set. Obviously, as you're starting out, you might decide to do some work for a cut price, especially if you're helping out friends or colleagues, which is fine. But it's really important to remember that as a translator, as indeed you would be as an editor or proofreader, you're carrying out highly skilled work, and your training is not run of the mill. So never undervalue your expertise, especially, I would say, if you're hoping to reach a point where you can rely on translation for regular income. And I'd also encourage you, particularly at the start of your translation career, to consider the non-financial value of any potential jobs that you take on. If it's a well-known author, scholar or publisher whose name will look good on your portfolio, then that's added value. Ask yourself what doors this job might open in terms of future work, whether that's long-term collaboration with a scholar or demonstrating in the context of your portfolio that you're able to work in this particular new academic discipline. The next step, once you've begun to form foundation in translation, is to start to expand your network. Now, there's no one way to do this, but I think there are a number of key areas where you might look to focus your attention. Of course, it's massively helpful if you can begin to establish relationships with academic publishers. Now, in my experience, there's often only fairly limited value to sending an editor a copy of your translation CV. Very few academic publishers, even the large ones, have in-house translators, and it's often left to the author to source a translator for themselves. This means that taking on work for an author can often be the best way to establish a relationship with a series or subject editor. And if they're impressed with what you've done, they may well recommend you to authors in the future. It's also worth remembering that series and journal editors are very often established academics themselves. So if you're looking to pick up regular translation work, then a good first step can be to sit down at your computer and figure out which key players you already know through your existing networks. I'll very briefly mention translation agencies, although I've said that there are actually relatively few that deal specifically with academic texts. A quick Google search will turf up one or two that claim to cater to the arts and humanities. Most of these agencies will want to see extensive samples of your work before they take you on. And of course, they will take a substantial cut of any profit from the client. Now, this can vary massively, but it could be anything up to 50% of what the client pays. And it's the question of weighing this disadvantage against the advantage of having regular work brought in for you. Very briefly, it's also worth thinking about tangential sectors where your expertise as a medievalist would be an advantage. Now, I won't go into great detail here, but auction houses and antique dealers, for example, often commission catalogues and other publications that may require translation from or into English with a high level of specialist knowledge. So again, it's worth thinking about the areas around your field, around your existing knowledge, and how you might be able to draw on the connections that you already have there. Finally, online freelancing platforms. There are a great number of these on the internet. You've probably encountered many of them yourselves as either a freelancer or a client. I want to mention just a couple which I think are quite useful tools for translation. The first I already referred to is prose.com, which is dedicated exclusively to translation, and it claims to be the biggest online marketplace for freelance translation work. Clients post jobs for translators to bid on, and they can also view translators' profiles and approach them directly. Now, you can sign up to Prose for free, but if you're serious about using it, you'll probably want to pay for a membership, which will cost you somewhere between $110 and $170 per year. This isn't cheap, but it gives you first access to new jobs as they're posted, and it also ensures that you appear higher up the directory of translators. Prose also offers access to various translation tools and a really helpful forum with a network of genuine experts in translation to answer your questions. The second platform I'm going to mention is Upwork, which is a US-based platform with a large international client base, and it offers access to all manner of freelancing work. In my experience, the amount of specific academic translation into English on Upwork is fairly limited, but there's much more out of English and plenty of more generalized translation work with quite a high turnover rate. Having said that, I've done some fairly niche jobs through Upwork, things like translating 15th century Italian poetry, so you can find stuff there to scratch that academic itch. And you may also find that your strong academic profile can make you a really appealing candidate to clients for other interesting jobs. Unlike Prose, Upwork is always free to register, but you have to purchase credits in order to bid on jobs, and the site will take a percentage fee from any jobs that you complete, normally 20%. One final thing that's worth noting with Upwork, Prose and other similar platforms. First, you need to be quite picky about the kind of jobs that you take on. So some of them will be advertised at a far lower rate than you're happy to accept. So skip over those immediately. Similarly, you may find that it takes you a little bit of time to get started on these sites and to bring in work. One reason for this is that at first you won't have many positive reviews, and that's one of the things that clients initially look at. But it's also crucial to work out how to effectively market your expertise. And I suggest that if you're new to these sites, taking a look at the profiles of established translators to see what works for them is a really good starting point. The more time that you spend navigating them, the better your idea will be of what kind of work is available and how you can use your profile in order to effectively win it. I'd also like to mention a couple of points that relate to working with international clients. As a translator, you'll often find yourself engaging with clients who are based abroad, and it's just worth bearing some of these points in mind. Firstly, financial perspectives can differ drastically, and depending on where in the world your clients are based, you might find that there's quite a discrepancy between your idea of a reasonable rate and what they are willing to pay. Now, of course, it's always good to be sensitive to this kind of thing, but ultimately, as a freelancer, you're your own employer, and it's important not to undervalue your work. Managing payments from abroad can also be complicated. Again, I can only speak to this from a UK perspective, but it can cause issues at both ends, especially when it comes to declaring tax. And I found that this is particularly the case if you're being paid not by an individual, but by a foreign publisher or a university. So for instance, the majority of Italian universities require something called a declaration of fiscal residency before they're happy to release any funds to a freelancer working abroad. A final point to make English is, of course, a global language, which can be both a huge advantage as you navigate the freelance workspace and a complicating factor. As a translator, you may find that many of your clients already possess a very good level of English and that they're very willing to communicate in English rather than the source language. This does mean, however, that they may want to ask extensive questions about your translation, how you've approached it, the choices that you've made. And my only advice here would be to say that it's best to try and take this in good faith, whilst being confident that you're the expert and that you have translated, according to your expert knowledge and your experience in the field. Lastly, and I apologise because this really has been a whistle-stop tour, I'd like to touch on some of the ways in which working as a freelance translator can actually be beneficial to your academic career. Now, we all know that university teaching is becoming increasingly fragmented, and indeed, if you're looking at taking on freelance work, then this is probably one of the key reasons why. I found actually that working as a translator can open new doors in terms of the teaching that's available. Looking beyond modern languages departments, where there's a constant need for linguistic specialists, language instruction is obviously key for postgraduate students who are carrying out research in medieval studies, and having the experience as a translator may boost your credentials to teach modules that are aimed at comprehension, reading, and other research skills. I've also found that translation has expanded my own research networks and horizons. Working with international scholars in fields close to my own has opened up new lines of inquiry and has also led to interesting possibilities for future collaboration. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'd like to return to that quote that I started with. For me, working as a translator alongside other academic commitments has allowed me really to take back control over my career narrative and to feel much more like an active and positive agent in my own professional life. And I very much hope that if you're considering looking at freelance translation for work, that it can do the same for you. Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank all of our panelists. This has been tremendously useful. I have learned so much, and I hope that, that all of you have as well. We have had a number of questions come in. I'm going to start with one that we got earlier, and then I'm going to proceed to several that we just received. The first one should be a relatively short one. The first one was, should you have separate websites for your academic and editing work, or is this something that you can put on a single website and have one section for academic work with all of your lists of publications and one section for your editing work? What would the various panelists recommend?
So I can only speak to my own experience, but I have a single website that has different tabs. It's a WordPress website. It's very simple, and it has tabs for academic research, for teaching instruction, and for editing services. And it's been interesting because I found that sometimes potential collaborators or clients spend a lot of time actually reading the academic research page and sort of learning about, they're interested in the depth of expertise and authority as well as the breadth. I had a wonderful conversation with a potential collaborator who works in tech, and she just happened to really appreciate the academic work, and we talked about that more than my editing work. So my own experience, I mean, maybe it scares people away who don't even contact me, but I found that it's possible to have a sort of healthy intellectual ecosystem represented on your website.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on this?
I'd be very happy to. So at the moment, I have a website which is dedicated kind of purely to freelance work, but it's very much geared towards, suggesting that I work as an academic freelancer primarily. And in the past, I've then relied on whatever university that I've been at for however long to kind of host my research portfolio. Actually, though, this is something I've been thinking about as I move forward in my career. I think Sarah's points are really important. And going back to what I was saying a minute ago, I think one of the things that we can really try to do as freelancers and academics is to try and present those two sides of the coin in ways that are mutually beneficial. I have always found it very impressive when I go on the sites of academic peers who happen to do other things, like, you know, they might work as a film journalist or something like that. And I always think, well, that's the coolest thing ever. So actually, perhaps there's a possibility that if we aim to do that, other people viewing our sites might kind of be similarly impressed by the two sitting alongside one another.
Yeah, I mean, I also have a similarly a website set up similarly to Sarah's, where I have my academic work and my teaching in one section, and then I have editing work in another section, public scholarship, whatever it is that I'm doing. So another question that we had, there are two in particular. I'm going to go ahead and set that one to answer live. It is, do you recommend acquiring professional liability insurance to cover para-academic work? If so, how much insurance should one carry? Does anyone, because that didn't come up at all. And I confess I know nothing about that.
Well, I mean, I can't speak to it too much. I do not have professional liability insurance. It's not something that I've felt necessary for me. I mean, it's you know, you base it on an assessment of risk, really. Certainly, it would be called for in certain writing and editing contexts. If you're writing copy for a pharmaceutical company, you know, then yeah, I would recommend it. With, you know, academic editing, I don't think it's strictly necessary, but I would urge you to ask other people, not me, but I can tell you that I do not carry it myself.
So next question. Does anyone have any strategies for managing freelance work while still in graduate school? And specifics of the question are that not only are there other demands on your time, but it's also very difficult to be honest with faculty administration about these demands, and also the issue of graduate funding, where sometimes graduate funding comes with the stipulation that you cannot do work outside of the university. So does anyone have any strategies for how one could manage trying to start a freelance career while still dealing with the demands and the contractual obligations of graduate school?
So I think I really appreciate this question. So thank you for the person who posed it. I think I spoke to this a little bit. You know, certainly for me, it was a challenge in terms of time and energy, and I spent a lot of time on, there's a resources on, if you're familiar with this website, the Center for Faculty Diversity and Development. I know that UVA is a member institution, but they offer, and I'm sure many other organizations do as well, a lot of really supportive and specific webinars and resources on time management. I think there are ways also, for instance, if you're doing a great deal of archival research, to partner with the repositories where you're working and see if there's any content that you can, or programming that you can create or collaborate with them to begin the networking process. I found that at least at UCLA, which was a very sort of wonderful, dynamic institution to be in graduate school at, there were lots of opportunities for gig labor of all different kinds, and often really sort of rewarding and intellectually intensive labor, whether it was doing cataloging of early print pamphlets at special collections, or working on special digital projects through the Environmental Institute, or other likewise. So I think there's a way to turn, if you're a graduate student, to turn that in connection in a university institution into really rewarding and often paid or stipended work. And increasingly, I think institutions, departments will offer especially summer stipends. I know UCLA does, for you to then go work out in the community and partner with organizations. So in lieu of specifically a research stipend for your dissertation research, it's a more sort of paraprofessional stipend to do work in the community. And then that's a wonderful way to forge to develop your network and forge connections. And I think if your university doesn't have a system in place, that's a wonderful proposal for a dean, or a wonderful pitch as a way to address and redress some of the major issues of labor inequity that we're facing in higher education. So if you feel comfortable reaching out with specific ideas of what kind of a budget, what kind of a project you personally would want to see take place, develop in the next 2 to 3 years, I think that's one place to start as well.
A related question, actually, do any of the panelists work in contexts with restrictions on outside work or with university regulations on conflicts of interest related to outside income? Yeah, I didn't think so. I'm not so, I feel like that might be more of an issue for people working in STEM than people working in humanities, but I'm afraid I don't really know anything about that. That might be a question that's worth bringing up in the next panel, where I know there are also a couple of editors who work outside the humanities. So I would recommend that that whoever asked that question perhaps consider either addressing it to the next panel that's happening on the 22nd, or we can try and see and ask around if anyone knows anything more about that.
I can actually, sorry to interrupt. Just to quickly say, I don't know if this would be helpful for either of those two questions, but one of the things I did when I was still a graduate student finding editing work was I specifically sought out opportunities working with, professors, scholars at the university that I was at the University of Michigan. And if you can be paid through their research accounts, which I often could be, then you're not working outside the university. I don't know if those opportunities would be available to you, but I'm thinking of those of you who are worried about restrictions on graduate funding and working for someone else, maybe that would be something that you could find.
That's a great suggestion. So there are two questions that are related to content creation, and so I think these will be good questions, particularly for Sara or for Matthew, because one of them is related to translation. So when you're creating content, one of the questions asks, is it important to start your own things, like organizing a podcast, posting on your own website, starting your own blog or article series, or is it all right to have things that you have produced as part of other people's projects? And then the related question is it worth building a portfolio of uncommissioned translations, like doing your own translation of a medieval text, doing your own translation of something obscure that you came across in an archive, or is it better to prioritize work that yields immediate utility or immediate publicity?
Okay, great. Another great question, thank you. I think it's best to do both. I think it's wonderful to show that you can collaborate on a project with multiple stakeholders by creating content. That's one important part. And I think it's important to also have self-authored or self-created independent projects. And I think you could imagine various ways of balancing or negotiating that. I mean, I also think that a collaborative project might be more likely to have a stipend attached, which is something I know that that's sort of how I started with projects that already had dedicated secured grant proposals and community partnerships, so I could jump on board and produce. And I actually found that writing about topics that other people chose was surprisingly rewarding. Intellectually, I learned about topics and became passionate about topics that I never would have imagined initially. But then, of course, you inevitably will have interests in areas where you want to write about or talk about in a media site that are very personal to you. Like, I like writing a lot about food from the Caribbean, where I'm from, and that's all on me, or about Ira Gershwin. So I think it's actually a nice balance to have independent projects and collaborative ones for your own sort of personal sense of value, but also because it means you'll be coming into contact with other humans, which I think is important at this point.
Yeah, and to address that second question, which was about building a portfolio of work and whether you might want to present uncommissioned translations that you've done off your own back, or whether it's better to just present published translations. I think really the key and this particularly is the case when you're thinking about how to present your portfolio on your website, is to approach it from the perspective of a client. So if you've got a published translation somewhere, no matter what the journal is, it could be, some of my first jobs were for kind of graduate institutional level journals. If you have a translation that's been published, that's a kind of a sign that you're producing work of publishable quality. So as excellent as it can be to say, I'm really into, I've done this great modern translation of Bede, and as much as that might show your enthusiasm for the subject, I think, yeah, publication outweighs passion probably from the client's perspective.
And there are two more questions that are both related to translation specifically. So I will address both of those to Matthew. The first one is about credentials expected for freelance academic translators. Are there expectations? What kinds of expectations do people tend to have?
Expectations would vary, really, I would say. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it's not massively professionalized. So most academic translators don't have a master's in translation studies. The vast majority may not be particularly familiar with aspects of translation theory. And actually, this relates, to the previous question. I think ultimately the best credentials you can show are that you've published your work previously. It's obviously very helpful to think about your CV. Think, I'm a native English speaker, so I have to think about how I demonstrate to clients that I have a good enough level of Italian to deal with obscure medieval Italian texts. And that's partly looking at qualifications, and it's partly a question of selecting publications that are on sufficiently erudite subjects or seem sufficiently erudite. So yeah, the good news is you don't need to have a translation MA. Try and think creatively about how you can show your credentials to the client.
So the next question is, how do you manage payments as a freelancer so that you don't get taken advantage of? And have any of you dealt with situations where people are either unwilling to pay or are unwilling to pay what you want them to pay? And how did you deal with those situations?
I can say, I mean, first of all, for projects of a certain size, I always ask for a deposit. Of a quarter, at least, of what I think the ultimate cost will be. And you can also do things like, build payments into the contract. So upon reaching certain milestones, every couple chapters, 50% of the book done, that kind of thing. So you can protect yourself that way. I've never personally had someone refuse to pay, so I can't speak to what to do if they don't pay the final amount. I mean, it is something to worry about, but if have a contract, I guess I would say, to protect yourself generally.
We have had a couple of comments. I mean, some of them are questions and some of them are comments related to working during graduate school. One of the things that I do want to bring up that I think is relevant is someone brought up international students on visas. That I do not know. I know there are very strict rules as to how much they can work outside of the university, what jobs they can take, how much money they're able to make. So I don't want to necessarily claim to be any kind of expert on this. I do not know, but that is something that I think we can look into and try to get some of that information onto the website later, so that we can at least try to answer that question or point to resources where those questions can be answered. Since I do know that we do have a pretty substantial population of international students in medieval studies who are working in the United States specifically. So for anyone who has questions about that, we will try to get information about that onto the Medieval Academy's website later on. Let's see, what are some of the other questions we have? So here's one question that again is a little bit for Matthew, but also can apply to everybody else. Do computer-assisted translation tools help at all? Are they things that freelancers tend to avoid? Do they not apply? And if there are, and are there any that are worth using?
I think that's a great question. In terms of academic translation, I rarely would use computer-assisted translation tools, and I think probably the same applies to the majority of freelance translators. But actually, a lot of the time, it will depend on the background. I do know one freelancer who has a background in commercial translation and is very well versed in these tools, and you know, that's just part of the workflow. So it's never been something that I've particularly used. Things like contextual databases, though, are massively useful, I find, for academic translation. And actually, probably more than anything else, I find myself referring to historical dictionaries. So things like Florio for Italian is always open on my desktop. So yeah, that would be a regular go-to.
All right. So there was one more question about, there were two that I'm going to try and see that we have, if we have time to answer them. One of them is a question that's related to the earlier ones about content creation. How could a person who's trying to get started in a freelance career as a proofreader show the, show off the kind of content that would get people to hire them to proofread? Is that a question of just showing off things that you've written, or things that you've potentially proofread for others that that you haven't been paid for? What would you recommend to show people your skill as a proofreader?
So that's a great question. It's one that I've actually come up against, because some of the work I'm proudest of was done on confidential documents in the medical sector. So I actually don't have an editorial portfolio, so to speak, the way that I do for writing or academic research. And I would say that showing that you can write using different style sheets in different voices, and that, of course, all your work is clean, and having typeset publications helps a lot. But I also think, and I think this is something that Jonathan mentioned, having a referrals page where you have people vouching for you, or companies that you've worked for vouching for you, it's helpful. But I'm afraid I can't speak to, like, how do you show off your best work when some of that work is going to be internal or confidential. So it's a real concern.
So I'll jump in and say too that it can also help when you are able to have a reference from a press. So for example, if I were to want to acquire more proofreading jobs, having the imprimatur of the University of Chicago Press, which is where Osiris is published, would be very helpful. So a lot of these places will actually offer a proofreading test, like the one that I took for Congressional Quarterly Books. And some of them actually offer proofreading certifications. So you can actually do a course like that so that you can actually demonstrate that you have the skill. So there are ways to actually demonstrate that you are a solid proofreader. And it does help if you can actually offer a sample. So you can find something that you've proofread that is shareable, and show the marked up copy. And it will very swiftly give somebody the idea that you know what you're doing, that you have, as I said, the lingo.
That's
yeah,
great.
and I will just add to that many, for example, of the job postings on the EFA website will ask for a sample of your editing work, a proofreading sample, for example, and then they may also say that a proofreading test will be required before they go with your services.
And I think we have room for one final question. It's kind of a general one, and I think a pretty good note to end on. This question, I would say it can be addressed to basically pretty much anyone on the panel. Do you find there to be a general sense of camaraderie among freelancers, or does a spirit of competition tend to override it? The webinar seems to be an example of the former, while the latter seems to prevail in online freelancing platforms. Can one expect to find helpful advice by reaching out to other freelancers? And would you recommend networking with other freelancers?
I've had nothing but absolutely wonderful collaborative experiences with freelancers, and people that I've met that I didn't know they were freelancers at first, and we became friends, and they have helped me innumerably, and colleagues, including colleagues at the Medieval Academy, who have been so supportive, and whom I rely on to provide information or advice about rates or certain projects, or to just have a mock interview before a really important client meeting. So yes, I have found nothing but sort of very positive experiences. I might even add that it was a 180 from the academic job market that I had recently experienced. So yes, I would say that this is, for me at least, this has been a really supportive place. And I think there's right now more work than we can all necessarily take on. Maybe sometimes it's like a little feast or famine, but I do think that freelancers are also always happy to know other freelancers that they can pass certain projects to if it hits them at a time that they can't take it on.
I'd add to that to say that oh, sorry, Jennifer.
No, go ahead, Becky.
Just to build on what Sarah was saying, I would say that most of the most interesting and rewarding projects that I've worked on as a freelancer have been passed on to me directly by contacts who haven't had the time to do it. Yes, I think on some of the kind of the bigger online freelancing platforms, there can be a certain level of competition, but in person, I've never had anything but positive experiences. And yeah, my network of freelancing colleagues and friends has been massively supportive. So all positive, I think I would say.
What they said.
Yeah, I would just broadly agree with all of that as well. I think we're maybe running out of time, but I've generally found it to be a positive experience and a good thing, especially, I mean, if you want to figure out, what other people are charging, how to set rates, I think that it's been really good to network with other freelance editors. And yeah, so broadly agree.
Well, I think we are at 2:30, so I will go ahead and thank all of our panelists. This has been a wonderful discussion. I hope that all of our auditors have found useful things. And as I said, we will have a document with some resources and some other information that will go up on the Medieval Academy's website, hopefully sometime this week. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again to our panelists, and I'm very pleased to say farewell to everyone.